Welcome back to the Quiet Light podcast today. It's Pat Yates sitting in for Joe Valley, and I have the pleasure of having Chris Duty, an amazing advisor here at Quiet Light. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. This is exciting. We're trying to do this three-part series to educate people about SBA. There's been so many changes. So today we have Joe McAleer. Joe is the senior advisor and SBA acquisition specialist for MultiFunding, one of the leading firms of feasible term debt facilitation for business owners and entrepreneurs. Joe has 8 years of corporate finance background, partnered with 7 years at MultiFunding, where he's developed an expertise, found a niche segment with MultiFunding through fielding a vast number of acquisition opportunities in business brokerage firms like Quiet Light, who work closely with their buyers seeking to leverage help with their purchase. This should be a great combo because there's a whole lot going on in SBA these days. Maybe Chris, maybe you can give the listeners a little idea of what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, well, there's a lot changing. So SBA's put out some new guidelines. Those guidelines generally have to go through a few processes of feedback from the bank, which is happening right now. And Joe's going to talk quite a bit of that. I think it's going to be super interesting to buyers. And then from a seller perspective, Joe's going to talk a lot about the things that a seller should do to get their business prepared and what they might want to think about as they're going through the process of getting their business ready to sell, and how they might qualify from an SBA perspective. And I think finally, my biggest takeaway from this conversation was a lot of people think of SBA as a very rigid government entity. You got to follow the rules, and it's hard to get. And I think what Joe and us talk about is that's not the case. It's kind of individual from a bank perspective, and that there's a lot of flexibility. And ultimately, not surprisingly, the SBA and the banks themselves want buyers to succeed. And so they're changing rules around that. They're a bit more flexible than you think they are, and they're there to help you succeed if you're a qualified borrower and you have a business that you've won successfully to the point to where you can become pre-approved from an SBA perspective.
That's a great point. And for the people listening, whether you're a seller or a buyer, we're doing these to make sure people understand the change in regulations, how much more easy it's become to look to get a business listed or bought through SBA. So I'm just excited to talk to Joe about this and hear his input. And so let's get right to it. How are we doing today, Joe?
Doing well. Thank you, Pat. Doing well. How are you?
I am great. Well, I've obviously got Chris Duty, an amazing advisor here at Quiet Light with me today, and I appreciate you joining us to talk some more SBA today. It's really exciting. A lot of changes in regulations, so we're trying to be able to get everybody up to speed on that. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing great. It's great to be on the podcast today. I think it's my first time on the podcast. I've done a webinar before, but excited to be on.
And those of you listening don't know Chris, you should read his bio on quietlight.com. Really amazing, unbelievable background for M&A. Super smart guy. I'd brag on him more, but he'd start blushing, and we don't want to do that during the podcast. And Joe, we're just excited to talk to you and want to learn more about your firm and on the SBA. So I know a lot of people out there, they understand SBA loans money for businesses. Most people don't really. Some people don't understand you can do it to acquire a company if you're trying to change your life and you want to do something different. So maybe give the listeners an overview of what the SBA does and what you do to help people with their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about SBA or business acquisition and you think about feasible term debt to do it, I mean, there's nothing better than SBA 7A for business acquisition. Reason being, of course, it's, there's no greater ability to get maximum loan to value up to 90% loan to value. And a maximum term of 10 years. When we're talking about non-real estate business acquisitions, goodwill acquisitions, and you have some banks that can be very, very forward thinking with leveraging that SBA government guarantee, right? The SBA is not your lender. This isn't a disaster loan made directly by a government. It's a conventional loan made by a bank that's guaranteed upwards of 75%, and even in some limited circumstances, 90%. Government guaranteed on that loan. So incentivizing, right, banks to make loans that they normally would not, right? You approach your bank, I want to buy this business, this e-com or this other business. And really all we're talking about is buying another business's cash flow or goodwill. Most banks don't want to carry maximum exposure. SBA, of course, limits that banks then will look at opportunities, look at your ability to successfully take over a business and be more forward thinking about the lack of collateral, lack of substantial assets to be able to be liquidated and still be able to get comfortable making those loans. So it's a tremendous program, and a great program that many folks have taken advantage of to do exactly that, right? Buy businesses, change their livelihood, maybe switch gears a little bit from what they've done historically, and take over, possess, and grow some tremendous businesses. So, that's the beauty of it. The really bread and butter we've found in the most recent years of SBA 7A is business acquisition.
Really good. So I think, qualifications, a lot of times people think, and maybe there's an expansion on that it's really hard to be able to qualify for an SBA loan. And I think there's a lot of fear for people of reaching out and trying to understand that if they've only ever done those kind of things. So, what are some pitfalls, maybe some reasons people wouldn't qualify, or other qualifications that people would want to know about if they came to you?
Yeah, I think what people need to understand is first and foremost, don't believe everything you read out there on the internet, right? Or don't believe all the stories you hear. The nightmare stories about SBA, or even if you approach a bank, right, and a bank tells you, no, this business isn't qualified, or you're not qualified, you may really be subject to a certain bank's credit box, because the SBA themselves, what their qualifications are to actually lend to an individual, the list is relatively short. In fact, they're really looking for more qualifications from the bank in order to make that loan and receive that government guarantee. So when you approach a bank, or you're looking to use an SBA loan to purchase a business, really what the SBA is looking for is a couple things from you. Do you have relatable experience in the subject business? And does that need to be an absolute straight line that you've worked in or owned the industry that you seek to purchase? Absolutely not. Another thing where it's going to be a little bit different from bank to bank, and how they consider you relatable, or how they gauge your past professional experience, and whether they feel that you would be a good potential owner operator of the business that you're seeking to purchase. The other thing that the SBA is looking for is that you're going to be a full-time owner operator. They don't finance passive investment. So a lot of folks, and especially in this day and age, when folks are thinking about investing in businesses, right? It's this new wave of as we've moved a little bit away from the real estate market, and stocks are all over the place. More folks have come to me in the last couple of years and said, I want to buy a business, right? I want to, invest in a business. Well, if you go to a bank and you say, I want to buy this business, and, it's got a great staff that runs the business, and I'm going to keep my day job, and I'm going to run it from afar, that's probably going to get a door shut in your face pretty quickly. The idea with the SBA is they're creating opportunities, right? So if you're going to buy a business, you're going to take over a business, you're going to be a full-time owner operator and be fully involved in that business. So really, again, very, very short list. The SBA themselves does not even necessarily have minimum personal credit requirements, right? Many folks might approach a bank and the bank says, oh, your credit is not good enough for an SBA loan. They don't even have a minimum score requirement. That's a bank-to-bank thing. Bankruptcies, right? If you have a past bankruptcy, a bank may be telling you, oh, you need to separate yourself 2-3 years or whatever, 5 years, 10 years from that bankruptcy. Again, not something that the SBA is necessarily drawing a line in the sand that you have to have separated yourself so far from a bankruptcy. So it's those types of things where I feel like people have probably gone to a bank and been told, this doesn't qualify, or you don't qualify. And you're really just talking about that bank's credit box, and you being on the outside of it, and maybe them blaming the SBA. So, those are just some of the key things that really the SBA is looking for. And then the rest of it really becomes about what the bank is looking for to fully qualify, that opportunity to help you buy that business.
That makes great sense. Again, we're talking with Joe McAleer with MultiFunding about SBA. Chris, let me ask you a question. I know that we talk at Quiet Light a lot about deal dynamics and how it opens up the pool of buyers when you get SBA pre-approval for a business. Maybe you could talk from, from an M&A standpoint, just pancaking on what Joe was talking about how it can help, people that want to sell their business if they can qualify for that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, from a seller perspective, if you're enabling the buyer to, leverage themselves and the money that they can put down to buy a business, that's better for everyone, right? It's something that the buyer is looking for. So instead of putting, $1 million down on the business, they can put $100,000 or $200,000 down or whatever that might be. That's great for the buyer, ultimately, because they can then amortize that loan over 10 years or up to 10 years, and then they can use a lot more of that money for cash flow to grow the business that they might have in their pocket. And there's all sorts of different dynamics that I'm sure Joe can talk about in terms of additional lines of credit and working capital that the banks can kind of bring up to help that buyer. It's also great from a seller perspective because not always, but in general, for the types of deals that we do at Quiet Light, it's mostly cash at close, right? And so from a seller perspective, you're not carrying any of the burden yourself in terms of seller notes and those sort of things. Now, that can be a part of the deal dynamics, but oftentimes it's not for various reasons that we'll get into. And so, if you're able from a seller perspective to, run your business in a way that looks good, as Joe mentioned, meets the basic SBA requirements, but is interesting to banks from both kind of the growth of the business, how it's being run, kind of the future outlooks, but also the buyer that's looking to buy the business. And most importantly, that you're not trying to do any, tax mitigation cheats on there, that your tax documents need to look exactly like what your business is, then you're doing yourself a great favor in terms of the valuation that you're going to get. And you're going to bring a lot more buyers to the table as well.
That's a really great answer. I know that, Joe, I think one thing that we talked about when we were, discussing the SBA is that I think people's initial reaction, okay, I'm going to get money from a bank. I'm going to run down the street to my buddy, Steven, who runs the bank down the road, who may not be the best resource if you're trying to be able to do SBA. So can you talk a little bit about why using someone like you that would be an SBA broker would be better possibly than a direct banking relationship they have?
Yeah, I mean, it goes right back to the point I made about credit box, right? And that's the thing. Every bank has their own interpretations of SBA rules, but more appropriately has their own internal guidelines about what industries they will lend to, what sort of collateral requirements they have, what personal credit requirements they have, to echo that statement from earlier. So, you may be looking at a business like, let's again use the example of e-commerce, right? Because these businesses trade hands pretty often and hold their value seemingly well. I think if a prospective buyer of an e-commerce business approached 10 banks that said that they do SBA, I would guesstimate that about at least 7 of those banks would probably have zero appetite to lend on e-commerce. And you guys have been in the space and dealt with it, and you probably could echo that sentiment, right? A lot of banks consider it too risky. The barriers to entry are quite small at times. They have older credit folks or board members that just feel like it's a bubble that will eventually burst. All these reasons it's too risky, right? Or a bank, maybe 3 of those banks that'll consider the e-commerce transaction, they associate so much risk to it, so they want to only lend at 80 LTV, or they want a certain amount of personal collateral coverage on that particular opportunity from the borrower for it to qualify. So these are just some good examples of, if you're approaching one bank or you seek to approach one bank that you think you have a great relationship with, or is telling you all these great things about what they can do on potential loans for business acquisition, you're playing within their box. And you may very quickly realize that, it's restrictive, or you're not able to get to where you want to be, or you're not able to get that loan approved, or you're not able to reach that loan consideration. And you may spin your wheels and waste time and get 3, 4, 5 weeks down the road, and suddenly the bank is changing their tune or telling you no, or changing that original proposal or structure that they had once said they could do for you. So when you work with somebody like myself, I take that guesswork out of the process. I'm approaching the 1, 2, 3 banks within my network that I know is going to be comfortable with the opportunity, with the risk factors, with the industry. I'm pinpointing those. I don't just shop an opportunity and throw darts and hope I hit near a bullseye or a bullseye with one of my resources. And I have a vast network of SBA preferred lenders from all over the nation. It's not the community or regional bank down the street. It's not the big names, BOA, Chase, to throw a few out there. Not that they're not capable, but, we find them to be sometimes a little bit less small business friendly. So, we go to these SBA preferred resources. Some of them are in the top 5, top 10, or top 25 lists. Some of them you may have never heard of. They have interesting or weird names, but they are tremendous resources for SBA preferred loans to acquire businesses. So that's what I'm doing. I'm really eliminating the wasted time, wasted efforts, going to the resources I know are going to be able to get things done, presenting a deal in a certain way, making sure we're getting ahead of trouble spots, things that banks may become iffy or may see as problematic, and making sure that when I get a proposal for somebody, for a client I work with, that's going to end up as an approval through underwriting. I think, I'm sure some of the Quiet Lake brokers could attest to, when I put expectations out there, or we go down the road with somebody, or I'm sharing precautions on a certain deal, or again, setting those expectations. And I like to be very careful if I recognize a risk. But when I get a proposal or I say it can do something, that ends up being what happens, right? It rarely, if ever, will my banks propose on a deal, we get down the road through underwriting, and then they say, wait a minute, we changed our mind. If that's the way my banks are going to do business, then, I'm not going to be able to work with them. And we hire and fire banks all the time. So, I think that's the biggest value add in working with me. There's no fee for my services, of course. The banks take care of us. So kind of a no harm, no foul. And again, allowing me to pinpoint that right resource and make sure that we get you to that approval is definitely a reason why it may be more beneficial to allow me to be an intermediary.
Yeah, that's great. So Chris, I know you obviously have a lot of experience in this, and you work with people that have done SBA deals before. Do you encourage buyers? I know we could talk about buyers and sellers combined, but more concentrating on buyers. You encourage them to go in and get, pre-qualified as they're looking for businesses themselves that are going to list to go in and get pre-qualified. Chris, maybe you could talk about how, preparation and the success level. I don't know if that's a good way to put it. If you've seen deals in the past that being that prepared, as he says, helps the deal close in the end.
Yeah, well, the way that I approach buyers is obviously there's a lot of eager buyers that have decided they want to buy a business, and oftentimes we're their first point of contact, and a lot of them have a good salary, a decent net worth, collateralized assets, those sort of things, and the way that they'll come through is they'll say yeah, I'll get SBA pre-qualified and I can get you a letter and those sort of things. What I do is I send them straight to Joe, primarily because I know Joe lives in reality, and he's going to qualify them based on doing a detailed assessment of their finances and get a better understanding of what they actually will qualify for. And I think that's what you're looking for, if you're going to an SBA broker from a buyer perspective, is to make sure that that person that you're working with is doing their diligence on you and not just providing you a letter based on what they're telling you. So I think that's one. And then two, this kind of goes for both buyers and sellers, where kind of the two terms that we need to get them familiar with is the debt coverage ratio and the loan to value, and how to think about valuations. We get that question a lot from sellers of, how does that impact my valuation? And maybe we can go through two examples here that will help illustrate that kind of. The first one being we sometimes have these businesses that have a lot of extra kind of goodwill and intangible value. That could be a patent, a utility patent, those sort of things, where all of a sudden multiples go kind of 5, 6, 7 and beyond based on that. Now, this can sometimes create a problem with SBA deals because of the loan to value and debt coverage ratio, which I'll let Joe get into in a second. The second is more of a traditional one where we're listing between kind of 3, kind of 4.5 multiples, those sort of things. And it might be a business that's stable or slightly declining. And that can put a cap on what can be lent against that. So in those two scenarios, I'll kind of kick it over to Joe so he can talk a little bit about what that means. I think that'll be useful to both our sellers and buyers, because that's the question we get most often about, how can this limit what I can borrow or what I can get for my business?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, Joe, maybe for the people out there that haven't dealt with those two things, maybe you can expand a little bit. I know we're going to talk about some deal dynamics too, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Chris is right. I mean, when you're utilizing SBA for business acquisition, you are put in a little bit of a box, right? From a debt service coverage valuation perspective, how much of a loan can I get towards the purchase of a business? I think the most financeable businesses, when people say to me, what is a multiple that I should be paying for a business where I can pretty much assure myself to be able to get an SBA loan? And my short-winded answer to that question is, somewhere in a 3 to 4x, range, right? And we don't really use multiples. We use at the loan level and bank level, we look at debt service coverage ratio. But when you're out there shopping in the marketplace, you're seeing multiples everywhere, right? So it's that 3 to 4 times usable EBITDA, I like to say. Now, if you're getting a deal below 3, awesome. That just means you're getting a better deal, right? And if you're getting it above 4, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not financeable. It means as we creep towards the 5s and the 5+ multiple range, it means our cash flow, that debt service is probably getting squeezed a little bit. And now we may be moving away from that maximum loan to value. You may be having to put more than 10% down or 15 or 20. It really just depends. And I get it. Some sellers really value their businesses differently or have certain assets, that need to be included or go beyond just the goodwill purchase of that business that can, make that valuation go higher. But to break it down, when folks say to me, well, what is a minimum debt service coverage ratio that banks are looking at? Again, it's going to vary from bank to bank. I would say that in this day and age of kind of rising interest rates, or a year where interest rates have really taken a jump, I feel like if I can speak from what I've seen, is we've moved away from like banks getting more comfortable with the minimum 1.15 times, and you're probably more at a 1.2 to 1.25x. And, that needs to be on a relatively consistent basis. Banks are looking at a weighted average of the most recent year of performance on the tax returns, and then kind of at a less weight on the years prior. So right now, speaking to today, we're looking at 2022, looking at 2021, and 2020 really holds very little weight. Businesses that have experienced some growth. And then if we're really leveraging a strong 2022, a lot of businesses have experienced some very rapid growth. And we look at those historical taxes and we're saying, okay, we're really getting all of our debt service support from that 2022 tax return. Then we're really focusing on the year-to-date financials as well. What's the ongoing trajectory? Is it continued growth? And that's how banks are going to get more comfortable with maybe the years prior not hitting our minimum DSCR, and that most recent year we've got some backbone to be able to make a loan. And then we start to look at who our sponsor on that loan is. So again, if you've got consistent basis year over year, a business that's, flat or depending on where it's priced, and you're hitting that 1.2, 1.25x, I think you're good to go there. But if it's a business that, is just rapidly changing and growing, that most recent year, maybe it needs to be at a 1.5 or a little bit higher, right? If the years prior are not hitting that minimum. And again, year to date, how are we looking? Are we on the up and up? Has the business kind of rounded back down? Those are things where we start to scrutinize it as well. But yeah, that's your kind of, and it all obviously goes together. Multiple goes hand in hand with, debt service coverage ratios. And I think, again, the key is maybe deviating a little bit from SDE to what I like to call that usable EBITDA. And that's just speaking to what the banks look at, right? SDE is certainly one marker that sellers commonly use, and I know brokers commonly use, but we need to break down what is comprised of that SDE and what things within that figure are going to be problematic for a bank to use or hard to prove, really, is the things where we kind of move away from some of the add backs. So as long as that usable EBITDA is giving us enough of a comfortable debt service coverage ratio, that's what we're after. I mean, plain and simple.
That's great. So again, we're talking with Joe McAleer with MultiFunding. And Joe, let me ask this: when people are coming in to get pre-approved, let's say their goal in the next 3 years to buy a business through whoever, and they want to get pre-qualified, you can obviously explain everything they need to pre-qualify. Do you advise people to get that done ahead of time because their search, they can just plug that in based on what they are pre-qualified for? How should people go about that?
That's a good question, Pat. I think there's no harm whatsoever in allowing me to work with you, gather some pertinent documentation, and set some expectations, whether you're, rapidly searching to find a business or you feel like this is going to be an ongoing search. I love it. I love the ability to build out a file for somebody, have access to that information. So when they start to find businesses, we can rapidly put it all together, allow me to put it all together, fully analyze an opportunity. And should they go under LOI, allow me to be able to approach one of my banks and present that opportunity as a whole. So I can come back to them within 24 hours or very, very quickly and say, hey, here's a proposal. We'd like to move forward with this transaction. Other folks, they prefer to wait, but ultimately that just, when they find a deal or they're, trying to get further along with a broker or a seller, and the ask or the demand is that they've been vetted and they don't have that pre-qualification letter. At that point, we need to kind of go through it, put it all together. And I'm pretty demanding. If you want something from me, I need these items from you, and it's nothing remarkable. It just requires a little bit of dedication, maybe a half hour to an hour of time to put together a couple pieces of paper, and then I can set expectations for you. So it's a thing that I would say do it earlier, because it'll open the door for you with conversations with brokers and sellers when you have that piece of paper that shows you've been vetted. Otherwise, you may find something and find yourself scrambling a little bit.
That's great. And Joe, we've done some interesting, some unique deals lately that have had some interesting deal dynamics that have certainly helped the buyers take on the business, and banks have been, fairly accommodating in terms of understanding the type of business, maybe the seasonality of the business, and giving them the financial instruments that enable them to be successful. And I assume that you've been a pretty big part of that behind the scenes. You want to talk a little bit about, some more non-traditional deal dynamics that can be worked in, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the changing SBA rules that could further enable that.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a great point, Chris, and I mean, speaking to my involvement, not that, banks on their own are not capable of being a little bit forward thinking or being accommodating, but yeah, I see all types of businesses. We worked on a rather unique one where the business really made all their money in a 3 to 4 month period, right? So, you look at that transaction and we were saying to the bank, are you comfortable with this, number one? And they were. It was a tremendous business. It just, it evolved around being able to sell product in the winter. And we had a great, highly qualified, borrower that made the bank feel comfortable during the slower months that, if times were really bad, that buyer was going to be able to comfortably, help in situations where the debt would need a little bit of a boost from some personal income. But what we're able to do is get the bank to provide, I think it was at least 6 months, if not maybe a little bit more, of some interest only payments, or a little bit of forbearance on the front end of those payments. They also provided the borrower with a working capital line of credit to accommodate some working capital at cash at close for operations, but also, floating some of the slower months or unforeseen circumstances with inventory and other things as they took over that business, and had to transition. That's the most difficult time for any given new business owner, is the immediate transition or takeover of a business and being hit with some of the unexpected. So we felt like, we really, really positioned this borrower in a way that he could be comfortable taking over this business in a time where, I think he was going to be afforded the ability to take most of the busy season and make it his own, but be prepared for the slower months to come and float him to the next year when the business would be making their strides again. So, that was something where I had to kind of, push on my resource, but lean on them, get feedback of what they felt they could do, work with my client, the borrower, to make sure he was going to be comfortable and that this was enough for him. We don't want to set folks up for failure. All right. That's the key. Got to make sure that the bank is giving you what you want, or as close to it, to where you feel comfortable that you're going to be successful, with the business and be able to make those loan payments. So that was a good one. And that's a good example. A lot of industries have their ebbs and flows or their seasonality. So make sure you're teaming up with a bank that's being, somewhat accommodating to that. And if not, maybe it's time to speak to somebody else. In terms of some of the new rules, there's some tremendous things happening, which I think is going to open the door for a lot of people. And I'm already seeing it open the door on some deals that I'm working on right now. The biggest ones that I'll mention, is number one, this partial buyout rule. For years, we've struggled with the inability to have ongoing seller or owner involvement in a business. And people come, sellers have wanted that. A lot of sellers want to retire, ride off into the sunset, do the transition and be done with it. But a lot of sellers, this is their baby, right? They want to make sure that there's ongoing success in a business, and they're willing to stick around. And the SBA had kind of drawn a line in the sand, and it's still drawn when we're talking about complete buyouts, that a seller can only remain for a period of 1 year, and then they have to go away. And I think they finally realized that was a little bit silly, and it really help create success with new ownership and transitions of businesses, to allow an owner to continue to advise and be involved and have some stake in a business. This could do some really great things and assure that that these transitions, these acquisitions are more successful, right? So now you can buy a portion of a business. You can buy 50% of a business. You can buy 90% of a business. I mean, you throw whatever number out there, you can keep a seller involved in the business. The one key factor, of course, is that, any owner, the rules still exist, that any owner in the borrowing entity or in the business would need to personally guarantee the loan if they own 20% or more of the subject business. So, owners, we see a lot of deals already where, owners will stick around with 15%, 10%, 5%, something like that. But that still allows us to leverage their experience. And another key is leverage their license. We have these businesses where there's a license that is required to operate that business. And another instance in the past where you had a lot of deals that were seemingly great deals, but, specialty contracting and services businesses where somebody can't go out and get a license in a month or a year. You really couldn't close a transaction saying, oh, I'm going to borrow the seller's license, or I'm going to eventually get it. That was really difficult, if not impossible, to get banks comfortable, because the SBA states that you're supposed to have that license procured before you close. So we were having to kind of figure these deals out and find people or key employees. It was messy. Now I'm already working on some deals, specialty contracting style deals where, that license, we're able to keep the seller, involved in the business, 5% ownership, 10% ownership, and we can leverage their license on an ongoing basis. The beauty of the SBA in these, partial changes of ownership, you actually have the ability in 2 years' time to go and get another SBA loan and take the seller out of their remaining position. You don't even have to use your own cash if you don't want to. So 24 months, if they're ready to move on, you're ready to buy them out, you can seek another SBA loan if things have gone really well. So awesome, awesome things with partial buyouts. That's a big one that the SBA has finally opened the door. The other big one is, the changes to sellers helping with the required 10% equity injection. Again, very, very restrictive in the past. If the seller were to help you with any of your 10% equity injection, it required a seller note on complete standby. Complete standby meant, the life of the SBA loan, which of course, non-real estate 10 years, real estate involved even longer. So, I saw a lot of deals where sellers were not really willing to say, I'll wait 10 years to get paid on this 5% or whatever, to be able to help, this random buyer who wants to buy my business. So they've removed that restriction. And now a seller can actually provide the entirety of your 10% equity injection. And all it requires is a 10-year amortization or 10-year amortized seller note and only a 2-year standby period. Okay. So way less restrictive. I'm already seeing deals happening, where banks also have to get comfortable with a complete lack of equity injection. But already seeing some deals come together where, banks are more open to allowing a borrower to retain their cash if a seller is willing to provide that equity injection. The other one, of course, is okay, if somebody is bringing at least 25% or 2.5% of the 10% equity injection, the rest can come from a seller by way of a 10-year amortizing note with only a 2-year interest-only period. So payments can begin on day one, not even required to do standby, and they can be bringing 7.5% of your required 10% equity injection. So, really has quickly opened the door. And then there's another rule, which we're still kind of, feeling out or figuring out, but I know it's out there, that you can trade equity for down payment. So I think they just need to hone in on that one. And it has to do with a business's, debt to worth ratios. But there's a rule out there that I think will also open up come August 1st, when more banks can be a little bit more understanding of the latest SOP, where you may even now be able to be trading, seller equity, retained equity for down payment. Haven't seen that one used quite yet. I think it's still one that there's a lot of gray area, but we're rapidly seeing sellers providing down payment by way of these seller notes in a far less restrictive environment. So, those are your big rule changes as it relates to things that really have impacted the business acquisition space, and that I think are going to really open the door for a lot more businesses to change hands under some more friendly structuring.
Yeah, that's a great overview there of the new rules. I'm sure all of our buyers that are listening, their kind of ears just lit up when you said that they could bring no money down to a deal. For those specific things, so as a bank, you're looking at a borrower that is ultimately not going to bring any cash to the table, right? From a bank perspective, how do you think they think about the best type of borrower in that scenario? Like, what does that borrower need to show to be able to, come to a business where the seller obviously agrees to do a note to put down their down payment? What does a bank look for that borrower?
I think the instances when you're going to see that the most is like, maybe there's a key employee or a manager that wants to buy a business, right? And from the seller's ready to move on, and they don't have a lot of cash, right? And I think you're going to see opportunities where, banks look at an individual and maybe they see that there's limited liquidity, but generally speaking, they see this potential borrower, buyer as a really great fit. I think those are the instances where you're going to see banks getting a little bit more comfortable that somebody doesn't want to, or a seller is willing to provide them their equity injection. When that rule was first announced back in the second week of May, we all within our organization and many bankers we spoke to were like, we don't see any banks, allowing people to bring nothing to the table. Banks always want borrowers to have some skin in the game. Even deals in the past when borrowers were looking to really, really leverage outside individuals and sellers for their down payment, most banks would be a little bit uncomfortable with that. So, now I'm already seeing, again, I'm seeing banks being open to it in certain circumstances and situations that you allow somebody to retain their cash. And otherwise, this is a really, really great opportunity. This is still a really, really strong opportunity. If that's the only thing that's lacking, or if we're allowing a seller to mitigate someone exhausting their liquid resources to get a deal done, yeah, let's go ahead and let a seller help if they're willing to do that. So, it's a really nice tool. And I think in certain instances with banks that are the most forward thinking, it's going to be highly utilized.
That's great. And I think that's a good message for the sellers out there. Oftentimes I talk to sellers that they do have a key employee that they would prefer to sell the business to, but for various reasons, because that key employee might not have generated, enough wealth or kind of savings to be able to purchase the business with an SBA loan. This might open the door for that. And that could be the best outcome for both the seller and the employee, and ultimately the business going forward. Because obviously that key employee likely knows the business better than any possible person that could end up buying that business.
Absolutely.
Joe, let me ask a question. I know you gave so much good actionable information about this. We could talk for a couple hours about this, I'm sure. I do have a question because, sort of when you look at these changes, it seems that they're focused on one thing, and it's consistent throughout a lot of things that I heard, whether it's an aggregator who paid cash for a business in the past. People sometimes don't know what they don't know when they buy businesses. So is there really, to me, there's a strategic advantage of being able to keep that owner on, at least for a period of time, that expertise, that consistency, that ability to grow. And it just, to me, it kind of can be a win-win from two standpoints. Number one, that consistency. Second of all, maybe a buyer or a seller is able to sell a business in a more creative situation that makes it thrive even further in the future. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems to me the regulation changes came from something really specific of possibly failures or difficulties scaling a business once they buy it because they don't have that owner. I mean, is that part of the idea here from the SBA?
I do believe so. I mean, I really think that like the SBA finally opened up their eyes a little bit and said, we could be allowing more successful transactions to happen, or more long-term success, or yes, remove some of the risk of failure in an immediate change of ownership by allowing, current business owners to have ongoing involvement and ongoing ownership in a business. It is, I mean, I can't tell you, like, if you look up the default rates of SBA loans, they are extraordinarily low. And in our 14 and a half, 15 years in business, we were, looking up all the defaults we've been tied to. And it's like, I think we had like 13 or something like that. It was an exceptionally low number. These loans tend not to fail. But again, I've also had a lot of business owners that I've helped buy a business, and it was seemingly a tremendous, opportunity, a really solid business that was making really great money. And those folks reached back out to me months later or a year later and, were lamenting to me, wow, Joe, I didn't know that that I had to dedicate 60 hours of my week to this business. The seller made it seem so easy. And Joe, I didn't know that there were these expenses, and I didn't know that there was this and there was that. And not that they were in jeopardy of going into default, but I think about those opportunities, and in some of those conversations, it was like, my client was almost lamenting that the seller was gone, like literally gone, wouldn't even pick up a phone call to to help them through a difficult time, something that they probably would have very easily understood everything about, but now this new owner of this business was kind of on their own. So I think that's the idea here. If you can remove the risk of these transactions failing in the first year, first 2 years, first 3 years, and create a higher trajectory or a path to growth, ongoing growth and success of that business, that's what you want to do here. And again, the other one, with the licensing and the relatable experience, we're able to shrink that gap where, somebody that wants to buy a business that really doesn't necessarily have that, overall experience and industry experience or having that license, that's one of the things that this is really, really opening the door for. So, I think that's where they got it right. And I think that's immediately where I'm starting to see, some transactions come together where 4 months ago, I would have had no clue how to make it happen.
Got it. That's super helpful. And then as you think about, some of the current market issues that are out there. So, we hear from both buyers and sellers, oh, interest rates have gone nuts, right? Or there's scenarios where businesses are, declining 20% year over year, or possibly even more to that. Coming out of COVID, things are stabilizing, those sort of things. What are the issues that you're seeing now? Which ones can kind of be overcome? And I think you had a really good LinkedIn post the other day about talking about where interest rates are at for SBA loans. Maybe it'd be worth kind of restating that here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things I've definitely seen in the market over this past year is the market has somewhat reacted to higher interest rates. I think, it is what it has done is really it's shrunk the buyer box a little bit, right? I mean, if you don't have that appetite to pay a higher rate right now, then this isn't the time to buy a business. So you have that, the removal of some of the iffy buyers, or you have the folks that, really stick to their guns with debt service and all this stuff and factoring in higher rates. So, another thing, again, where you may be able to lean on some of these recent rules and keeping sellers involved to remove some of that risk, both mentally and realistically, higher payments on that note, ongoing performance of a business, growth, declines that you may see in a business. I know a lot of businesses I've been seeing, there's been some struggles to the start of 2023, maybe a slower start, or some months that have been a little bit troublesome. And there's a little bit of explanation for that, whether it be like inventory turn or just a slower period, or maybe some trouble with advertising or something like that. Or maybe a seller who's taken their foot off the gas just a little bit as they prepare to sell a business. So again, instances where ongoing seller involvement may be key, and maybe that's beyond that 1 year period. We really were never able to leverage like this whole, the seller is going to be a consultant for a year, and that changes the mindset of a bank to be willing to make that loan. Banks just think worst case scenario, that's their job. So, no longer is it the conversation of that quickly gets kind of dismissed of like, hey, the seller's going to help me. Now it's like, okay, the seller's going to retain 5 or 10%. And this is what they're going to continue to do with this business. They're going to continue to manage, these hurdles or some of the difficulties we've had in April or March or whatever it is. They're going to continue to make sure the ongoing relationships with suppliers and customers, their name is still tied to the business. These are the types of things where, some of those things can be overcome. and not be immediately dismissed by a bank when you're trying to convince them to help you buy a business that maybe has had, some trouble spots or maybe has some certain risks with a complete change of ownership.
It's really incredible. I mean, Joe McAleer again from MultiFunding. We could sit here and talk about this all day. There's so many good things. I think really the overview to me right now is that, the SBA is trying to work better with buyers and sellers to be able to try to make SBA opportunities available to be able to buy a business, sell a business, whatever it's going to be. I'm just excited about it because I think it gives so many more opportunities for people. And obviously, some consistency going forward in the business if you hold on to that owner. Chris, were there other things you wanted to go over? I think he answered every one of my questions, even though I'll probably like 100 after this.
Yeah, I agree. I think we could talk forever. I mean, I think the takeaway for me and pretty much every conversation I have with Joe is that, look, like this, people think of the SBA as being a government entity and it being, very rigid, but ultimately you're working with a set of banks that are interpreting, the SBA requirements, of which they're kind of quite minimum. As Joe mentioned, like most of those requirements are actually stated by the bank. There's a lot more flexibility here than one might think when you think SBA and government. And so, I encourage buyers that, if you're thinking about buying a business, reach out to Joe. He's the person that I send all of my prospective buyers to, can give you a really good sense on where you might be at, what you're going to qualify for, and he's going to do the diligence to make sure that you would be comfortable putting in an offer for a business.
Yeah, that's great commentary. I agree with that 100%,
Thanks,
Chris. So Joe, if anyone needed to reach out and get in touch with you, maybe you could tell everyone that's listening how to get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Google me. Number one, you'll find me out there on the internet. If you go to MultiFunding, you'll find me there, multifunding.com. My email is jmcaleer, my first initial, my last name, McAleer @multifunding.com. And then, of course, my direct number, which you can call, text, reach out to me anytime, is 856-325-9796. Those are all the ways that you can find me and get a hold of me. So yeah, anytime anybody has questions or wants some help or wants to talk SBA, because, again, like you guys noted, 45 minutes, you can't even scratch the surface of, all the things that encompass SBA lending. But yeah, I love to be a resource for folks. I love to be an educator, somebody people can rely on and reach out to. So yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to be here, Pat, and have Chris on here with us as well. I enjoyed it, and hopefully there will be more to come.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate your time today, Joe. It's been awesome. Thanks again from you, Chris. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.